"Easy, it hurts so bad," she whispered, and the wind seemed to carry those words across the whole town like a warning no one wanted to hear. Because out here, pain didn't stop anything, and mercy sure as hell didn't change a man's mind once he'd decided he was right. And yet somehow, those quiet words made one man look up when everyone else kept staring straight ahead. The morning sun hung low over the dust-colored street, painting long shadows across the wooden gallows, the kind built fast and used faster, with rough-cut beams and a rope that had seen more justice than truth. And beneath it stood Ayanna, wrists bound, shoulders steady, her dark hair tangled from the long ride into town, her eyes not wild or begging, just tired, like someone who had already walked through something worse than this and knew there was no point wasting breath on fear. The crowd gathered close, boots scraping dry dirt, hats pulled low, whispers passing like dry leaves in a breeze. Not one of them asking if the story was true, not one of them needing it to be, because to them, the answer had been decided the moment they saw her face, the moment they saw who she was. And the sheriff stood just off to the side, fingers hooked into his belt, jaw tight, not cruel, not kind either, just a man caught between what he knew and what he was too tired to fight. Someone muttered, "Get on with it," and a few others nodded, eager for the kind of ending that made their world feel simple again, neat and explained. And Ayanna shifted slightly, the rope brushing her neck, her breath catching just enough for that quiet sentence to slip out again, softer this time. "Easy, it hurts." Not a plea, not even directed at anyone. More like she was reminding herself to stay standing, to hold on to something inside that couldn't be taken. And that's when Caleb Rourke stopped walking. He had been passing through, nothing more. A shadow moving along the far side of the street, hat pulled low, coat worn from too many winters up in the high country where men learned to live without asking for anything. And he would have kept going, same as always, because getting involved meant trouble, and trouble was something he had buried a long time ago under miles of silence and mountain wind. But those words caught him the way a distant sound catches a hunter, sharp and out of place, and he turned his head just enough to see her, really see her, not as a figure on a platform, not as a problem waiting to be solved, but as a person holding herself together in a place designed to break her. The sunlight hit her wrist just right, and for a second, he noticed something small there, a faint mark, a scar maybe, or something older than that, something that didn't belong to this moment, and it stirred a memory he hadn't touched in years, something buried deep and quiet, like a fire that never quite went out. The man beside him chuckled, tipping his hat back. "Ain't worth the delay," he said, voice easy, like they were talking about a stray dog. And Caleb didn't answer, didn't move, just kept watching as the sheriff stepped forward, slow, like each step weighed more than it should, and the rope was adjusted. The platform creaked under her feet, and the air itself seemed to tighten, like the whole town was holding a breath it didn't realize it had taken. Caleb felt it then, not anger, not yet, something colder, something quieter, the kind of feeling that comes when a man recognizes a moment he's seen before and knows exactly how it ends if no one steps in. And for a heartbeat, he almost turned away, almost let it pass, because that was easier, because that was safer, because that was what he had trained himself to do. But her voice came again, barely there. "It's okay." And that was what stopped him, not the pain, not the rope, but the way she accepted it, the way she refused to let them take anything more from her than they already had. And something inside Caleb shifted, slow but certain, like a lock giving way after years of rust. And he took one step forward, then another, boots pressing into the dust as the murmurs around him faded into something distant, something unimportant, until the only thing that remained was the sound of his own footsteps and the steady, quiet rhythm of a choice he hadn't made in a very long time. The first thing people noticed was not the man himself, but the way the noise changed when he moved, because a moment ago the crowd had been alive with restless shifting and low voices, and now it began to thin into something quieter, like wind dropping before a storm. And Caleb Rourke walked straight down the center of the street without hurry, without looking left or right, his boots steady against the dry boards and packed dirt, each step measured as if he had already decided where he would stop long before he took the first one. A man near the front scoffed under his breath, nudging the one beside him, whispering something about fools who forgot their place, but the words did not carry far, not anymore. because there was something in Caleb's presence that did not invite conversation, something that made people unsure whether speaking was worth the risk of being noticed, and the sheriff saw him coming and straightened slightly, shoulders tightening beneath the weight of the badge, his eyes narrowing just enough to show recognition without welcoming it. Caleb stopped at the edge of the platform, close enough to see the faint tremor in the rope as it swayed with the morning breeze, close enough to hear Ayana's breathing, shallow but controlled, like someone counting each second and choosing to stay within it. And for a long moment, he did nothing at all, just stood there, head tilted slightly, as if listening to something no one else could hear. The silence stretched, uncomfortable, uncertain, and then he spoke. One word, low and even. Why? Not loud, not demanding, just placed there like a stone dropped into still water, and it spread through the crowd in ripples that no one could quite ignore. The sheriff cleared his throat, shifting his stance. It has been decided, he said, voice firm in the way men sound when they are repeating something they need to believe, and Caleb's gaze lifted slowly, meeting his without challenge, without respect either, just a steady presence that asked for more than that answer, and the sheriff hesitated, only for a fraction of a second, but it was enough for others to notice. Someone behind muttered, "She is Apache," and another voice added, "That is reason enough," and a few heads nodded, grateful for something simple to hold on to, something that kept the world from becoming complicated. Caleb's eyes moved then, not to the speakers, but back to Ayana, and she looked at him for the first time since he had stepped forward, not with hope, not with fear, just with a quiet awareness, like she understood what he was weighing and had already accepted whichever way it would fall. And that unsettled him more than anything else, because most people begged when they saw a chance. Most people reached for it, even if it was not real. But she did not move, did not ask, did not try to make him into something he was not. The rope creaked softly again as the sheriff shifted his grip, preparing to continue, to bring the moment back under control before it slipped too far, and Caleb glanced down, his eyes catching that same small detail he had seen before, the faint mark along her wrist, shaped like a crescent pressed into old skin, and the memory came sharper this time, clearer, a night years ago, a fire burning low, a hand guiding his with quiet patience, showing him how to bind a wound, how to wait instead of rush, how to see instead of assume. And for a second he could hear that voice again, calm and certain, telling him that strength was not in taking, but in choosing when not to. He exhaled slowly, the breath steady, and when he looked up again something had settled inside him, something that did not leave room for turning away. "You saw it happen," he said, not to the crowd, not to the sheriff, but to Ayana, and her brow furrowed slightly, surprised by the question, by the direction of it, and she shook her head once, small, controlled. "No," she answered, voice barely above the wind, and Caleb nodded, as if that was enough, as if he had expected nothing else. The sheriff frowned, stepping forward. "That is not how this works," he said, a little sharper now, and Caleb finally turned to him fully, his expression unchanged, his voice just as calm. "Then explain how it does." And there was no anger in it, no threat, just a quiet refusal to accept what had been handed down without question, and that was what unsettled them most. Not a man shouting, not a man drawing a weapon, but a man who stood there and asked for something none of them had prepared to give. The wind picked up slightly, carrying dust along the street, brushing against coats and boots, and somewhere in the distance a loose shutter tapped softly against a wall, a small, ordinary sound that felt too loud in the growing stillness. And Caleb took one more step forward, placing himself directly in front of the platform now, close enough that if he reached out, he could touch the rope, but he did not reach yet. He just stood there, looking up at her, and in that moment, the entire town seemed to wait, not for the sheriff, not for the crowd, but for what this one man would do next. The sheriff's fingers tightened slightly on the rope, not enough for anyone to call it out, but enough for Caleb to notice, because men who were certain did not hesitate, and men who hesitated were already losing ground they did not know they had. The crowd shifted again, boots scraping, a few stepping back without meaning to, as if distance might keep them from being pulled into whatever was about to happen, and Caleb did not look at them, did not acknowledge the weight of their eyes. He only watched the sheriff, waiting, patient in a way that felt heavier than any threat. "You are delaying this," the sheriff said, trying to steady his voice, and Caleb tilted his head slightly, the smallest motion. "No," he answered, calm as still water. "You are." And that landed harder than it should have, because it was true in a way no one wanted to admit, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was full, thick with the kind of tension that made men aware of their own breathing. Iona's hands flexed once against the binding, not struggling, just adjusting, and Caleb saw it, saw the control in it, the refusal to panic, and it matched something in his memory, something he had learned long ago from someone who never raised their voice yet was never ignored. He stepped closer to the platform, close enough now that the rough grain of the wood stood out beneath the sun, close enough that a single reach would bring his hand to the rope. But he still did not reach, not yet, because this was not about speed. This was about choosing the moment so clearly that no one could mistake it. "Who brought her here?" he asked, and this time he did not look at Iona. He looked past the sheriff, into the crowd, and a man near the front stiffened, shifting his weight, hat dipping lower over his eyes, and Caleb's gaze settled there, steady, unblinking, and after a long second, the man spoke, voice rough. "I did," he said, like it was something to be proud of, like it placed him on the right side of things, and Caleb nodded once, slow. "Then you saw what happened?" And the man hesitated, just enough, just long enough for doubt to slip into the space between words. "I saw enough," he replied, and a few others murmured agreement, quick, eager, trying to close the gap before it widened. Caleb let that sit, let the weakness in it breathe, and then he looked back up at Iona. "Did you run?" he asked, and she met his eyes without flinching. "Yes," she said, simple, honest, and the crowd stirred at that, voices rising slightly. But Caleb lifted one hand, not high, not commanding, just enough, and the sound dropped again, because no one was sure why they were listening, only that they were. "From what?" he asked, and she held his gaze a moment longer, then answered, "From men who wanted a story to end quickly." And something in the way she said it made the air feel different, like a truth had been placed there that could not be easily moved. The sheriff shifted again, impatience creeping into his posture. "That is enough," he said, more firmly now, trying to pull control back into his hands, and he reached toward the rope, intent on finishing what had been started, and that was when Caleb moved. It was not fast, not sudden, just certain, his hand coming up and resting against the rope where it hung, fingers closing around the coarse fibers as if testing their weight, and the entire street seemed to still around that simple contact, because it crossed a line no one had expected to be crossed. The sheriff froze, eyes dropping to Caleb's hand, then lifting again, searching for something in the man's face that might explain this, might justify it. But there was nothing there but calm, and that was what made it impossible to ignore. "Step away," the sheriff said, quieter now, not because he chose to lower his voice, but because something in him knew raising it would not help, and Caleb did not step away. He only looked at the rope in his hand, then back at the sheriff. "You said it was decided," he said, and the words carried no challenge, only observation. "I am deciding something else." And that was the moment everything shifted, not because of force, not because of threat, but because one man had refused to accept that a thing was finished simply because others had agreed it should be. The wind moved through the street again, lifting dust, brushing past faces and coats, and somewhere behind them a horse stamped once against the ground, restless, uncertain, and Caleb's grip on the rope tightened slightly, not pulling, not yet, just enough to show that it was no longer beyond reach, and Iona watched him, her expression unreadable, but her breathing had changed, just a little, as if something inside her had adjusted to the possibility that this moment might not end the way it was meant to. No one spoke now, not the man who had brought her, not the ones who had agreed, not even the sheriff, because the question was no longer what had been decided, it was what would happen next, and for the first time since the morning began, the answer did not belong to the crowd. The rope did not move, not yet, but the fact that Caleb's hand held it changed everything, because a moment ago it had belonged to the town, to the sheriff, to the weight of decisions made without question, and now it rested in the grip of a man who did not ask permission to see things differently, and that unsettled them more than any raised voice ever could. The sheriff drew a slow breath, his eyes fixed on Caleb's hand as if trying to will it away. "You are making a mistake," he said, and there was something quieter in his tone now, something closer to warning than authority, and Caleb did not argue, did not deny it. He simply nodded once, almost thoughtfully, as if acknowledging that mistakes were part of every man's path. "Maybe," he said, voice low, steady, "but not today." And that answer did not give the sheriff anything to push against. It did not open a door for argument. It simply closed the one that had already been built. The man who had stepped forward earlier shifted again, unease creeping into his posture. "She ran," he insisted, louder this time, trying to bring the certainty back, trying to remind the others why they were standing here in the first place. And Caleb turned his head slightly, just enough for his voice to carry back over his shoulder. "So would you," he said, not accusing, not mocking, just stating something plain, something simple, and the man faltered, because there was no clean way to answer that without stepping into the truth he had been avoiding. The wind brushed past again, carrying the scent of dry wood and distant sage, and Ayanna closed her eyes for a brief second, not in surrender, but in something else, something like steadiness, like she was letting the moment settle into her bones before it changed, and when she opened them again, they found Caleb's face, not searching, not pleading, just watching, measuring, the same way he was measuring everything around him. Caleb shifted his grip on the rope, testing it once, not to pull, but to understand it, the way a man understands a tool before he uses it, and the fibers pressed rough against his palm, sun-warmed and worn, a thing that had been used too easily, too often, and he looked at it for a second longer before, lifting his gaze back to the sheriff. "You said it was decided," he repeated, quieter now, "but you never said who decided it." And the words settled into the space between them like something heavier than they should have been, because they forced a question no one had wanted to ask, and the sheriff's jaw tightened, his eyes flicking briefly to the crowd, then back again, as if looking for support that was suddenly harder to find. No one stepped forward, no one spoke, because standing behind a decision was easy when it moved on its own, but standing behind it when it was challenged required something more, something most of them did not have. Caleb took one slow step closer, the wood of the platform creaking softly beneath his weight as he moved within arm's reach of Ayanna, and for a moment, he did not look at her. He looked at the knot above, at the way it had been tied, careless, rushed, like the end mattered more than the process, and he reached up, not to tear it down, not to make a show of it, but to feel it, to understand how easily it could be undone if someone chose to do it. "You do not know her," he said, still looking at the rope, and the sheriff's voice came back, quieter now, less certain. "We know enough," and Caleb let out a breath that almost sounded like a tired kind of understanding, like he had heard that answer too many times before in too many different places, and he finally looked up at Ayanna again, meeting her eyes directly, and there was a question there, unspoken but clear, not about guilt, not about innocence, but about something deeper, something that asked whether she would stand if given the chance, whether she would carry whatever came after this, without breaking. She held his gaze without hesitation, and that was answer enough. Caleb's hand tightened slightly on the rope, not pulling, just holding it firmly, and then, without raising his voice, without looking at anyone else, he spoke again. "I am not asking you to agree," he said, his words settling into the quiet like a slow drumbeat. "I am telling you this does not end here." And that was when the weight of the moment shifted fully, because it was no longer a question, no longer a debate. It was a line drawn without sound, without spectacle, but clear enough that everyone could see it. And for the first time, the sheriff did not move to stop him, did not reach for the rope, did not try to pull the moment back into his control, because something in him understood that control had already slipped, not through force, but through certainty, and certainty was something he no longer held. The town stood still, caught between what had been and what was about to be, and Caleb Rourke stood there at the center of it, one hand on the rope, one decision away from changing everything. And the strange thing was, no one tried to stop him, because deep down, whether they admitted it or not, they were waiting to see if he would. For a long second, nothing happened, and that was the strangest part, because out here things usually moved fast once a decision had been made, but now time itself seemed to hesitate, like it was waiting for permission to continue, and Caleb stood there with his hand still wrapped around the rope, feeling the coarse fibers press into his palm, grounding him in the moment, reminding him that this was real, that this was happening now, not years ago, not somewhere far away where he could pretend. It was not his concern. Ayana's breath steadied above him, slow, controlled, and he could hear it clearly in the silence, a quiet rhythm that refused to break. And he glanced up once more, just long enough to see that her eyes had not changed, not softened, not hardened, just steady. And that steadiness carried something he recognized, something he had once been taught, and then tried to forget. The sheriff shifted again. But this time it was different, less about taking control and more about not losing it entirely. "You are crossing a line," he said, voice low, almost careful now. And Caleb considered that for a moment, not dismissing it, not challenging it, just weighing it the way he weighed everything else. And then he answered, "That line was crossed before I got here." And there was no accusation in it, no heat, just a simple truth that settled heavier than any shouted claim. Behind them, someone cleared their throat. Another stepped back, the movement subtle but spreading. Because once doubt entered a crowd, it did not stay contained. It moved from one man to the next, quiet and persistent. And Caleb could feel it without turning, could sense the shift in weight, the change in breathing, the way certainty was starting to thin. He let his hand slide slightly along the rope, feeling the knot again, tracing the path it would take to loosen, not rushing it, because rushing would turn this into something else, something louder, something easier to dismiss, and he had no interest in that. "If she is guilty," he said, still looking at the rope, "then the truth will hold." And he paused just long enough for that to settle. "But if she is not," and he did not finish the sentence, because he did not need to. The space after those words carried more weight than anything he could have added. The man who had brought her shifted again, more sharply this time, unease turning into something closer to defensiveness. "We do not need your judgment," he said, voice rising just enough to try to reclaim ground. And Caleb finally looked at him fully, his gaze steady, unblinking. "You already used mine," he replied, and the man faltered, confusion flickering across his face. "What are you talking about?" And Caleb's eyes did not leave him. "You used it when you decided without knowing," he said, and that landed in a way the man could not easily answer, because it turned the accusation back without raising it, because it showed him something about himself he had not planned to see. The sheriff exhaled slowly, the sound almost lost in the stillness. And when he spoke again, it was quieter, less certain. "This town needs order," he said, and Caleb nodded slightly. "Then start with truth," he answered. And that was the moment the balance tipped, not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly, because the sheriff did not respond, did not argue, did not reach for the rope again. And the absence of that action said more than any words could have. Caleb looked up at the knot one last time, then back at Ayana. And in that brief exchange something passed between them. Not trust, not yet, but recognition, the understanding. That this moment was about to change and neither of them would pretend otherwise. He shifted his stance, steadying himself. And then, with the same calm he had carried since he stepped forward, he began to work the knot loose, not tearing, not forcing, just undoing what had been done, each movement deliberate, each second stretching longer than it should have as the town watched in complete silence. No one moved to stop him. No one spoke. Because by now it was no longer about whether they agreed. It was about whether they had the strength to stand against what was unfolding, and one by one, that strength failed them, not through fear, but through the quiet realization that they might have been wrong. The rope slackened slightly under his hand, just enough to change its shape, just enough to show that it was no longer fixed in place, and a faint breath passed through the crowd, almost like a release, though no one would have called it that. Caleb did not look at them, did not acknowledge the shift. He only continued, steady, patient, until the knot loosened enough that the tension eased completely, and the rope hung differently now. No longer a final thing, just a piece of worn fiber. Swaying gently in the morning air, he stepped back half a pace, his hand dropping from it. And for a moment he said nothing at all, letting the silence settle over what had just happened, letting the weight of it reach every corner of the street. And Ayana stood there, no longer held by what had been meant to end her path, her shoulders still steady, her breath still controlled. But something had changed, something quiet and undeniable. And Caleb turned his head slightly, not to the sheriff, not to the man who had brought her, but to the space between them all. And in that stillness, it became clear that whatever came next would not belong to the crowd anymore. No one spoke after the rope loosened, and that silence felt heavier than anything that had come before it, because it was no longer the silence of agreement. It was the silence of people realizing they had been standing on something that was no longer there, and Caleb could feel it without turning around, the way the air shifted when certainty left a place. Ayanna did not move right away. She did not step down, did not rush to reclaim anything. She simply stood there for a moment longer, as if making sure the ground beneath her had truly changed, and when she finally took a slow breath, it sounded different, fuller, like someone who had been holding back more than air. Caleb stepped back from the platform, giving her space without looking at her again, his eyes drifting instead toward the far edge of the street where the dust met the open land, because he had not done this for recognition, and he had no interest in becoming the center of what came next. The sheriff lowered his hand from where it had hovered, uncertainly near the rope, his shoulders dropping slightly, not in defeat, but in something closer to acceptance. And when he spoke again, his voice had changed, quieter, stripped of the force it had carried before. "This does not make her innocent," he said, and Caleb nodded once, acknowledging the truth in that, because this had never been about declaring anything so simple. "No," he answered, calm, steady, "but it means you do not know." And that distinction settled into the space between them, difficult to argue with, harder still to ignore. The man who had brought her forward shifted again, but this time he did not step up, did not try to reclaim what had slipped from his hands, because something in him understood that pushing now would not restore what had been lost, it would only reveal more of it, and he was not ready for that. A woman near the back of the crowd spoke softly, almost to herself. She did not fight, and another voice answered, she did not need to, and those quiet exchanges carried further than any shout could have, because they were not trying to convince, they were trying to understand. Ayanna stepped forward then, one careful movement off the platform, her boots touching the ground with a soft thud that seemed louder than it should have been, and for a moment, no one moved to stop her, no one reached out, because the act itself had already been undone, and there was no clear way to rebuild it. She stood there, facing the town, her posture straight, her gaze steady, not defiant, not grateful, just present, and that presence made people look away, one by one, because it was easier to face an idea than a person, easier to judge from a distance than to stand within reach of what you had nearly done. Caleb glanced at her once, brief, measuring, and in that glance there was no question left, only confirmation that she would stand, that whatever came next would not break her, and that was enough. The wind moved through the street again, lifting the loose rope so it swayed gently behind them. No longer a fixed point, just a reminder of how close things had come to ending differently, and the sound of it brushing against the wood seemed almost like a whisper, something passing through and then gone. The sheriff looked out at the crowd, then back at Caleb, and for a moment it seemed like he might speak again, might try to gather what remained of authority and shape it into something usable. But instead he exhaled slowly and stepped aside, not making a declaration, not giving permission, simply moving out of the way. And that quiet action carried more weight than any order he could have given. Caleb adjusted his coat slightly, the movement small, habitual, and then he turned, not toward the center of the town, not toward the people who were still watching, but toward the open road that led out, because he had done what he came to do without ever planning to, and staying longer would only change the meaning of it. Ayanna watched him for a second, her expression unreadable, and then she spoke, her voice low but clear enough to carry. "You saw," she said, and Caleb paused, just briefly, not turning fully, only enough to acknowledge the words, and he answered without hesitation, "I listened." And that was all. No explanation, no claim, just a simple difference that said more than anything else could have. He continued walking then, his steps steady, the distance between him and the town growing with each one, and behind him, the people began to move again, slowly at first, uncertain, like they were learning how to stand in a place that had shifted beneath them, and Ayanna remained where she was for a moment, longer before turning in the opposite direction, away from the platform, away from the rope, carrying with her the quiet understanding that something had ended here and something else had begun, though neither of them would name it out loud. The town did not return to normal, not right away, because something had been pulled loose that could not be tied back the same way. And Caleb could feel it even as he walked away, the weight of it trailing behind him like dust in the wind, not loud, not demanding, just present. And that presence followed him past the last row of buildings, past the hitching posts and faded signs, out to where the road opened wide and the land stopped pretending to belong to anyone. He did not look back, not because he was certain of what he had done, but because looking back would ask something of him he had already given, and there was nothing left to explain. The sun had climbed higher now, burning off the cool edge of the morning, and the sound of his boots against the dirt settled into a steady rhythm, one step after another, simple, familiar, the kind of rhythm a man could lose himself in if he needed to. And for a few minutes, that was all there was, just the road, the wind, and the quiet space that came after a choice had been made. Behind him, the town stirred slowly, voices returning in low tones, not with certainty, but with questions that did not yet have answers, and Ayanna moved through that space without haste, her steps measured, her shoulders still straight. But there was something different now, something that did not come from relief, but from awareness, like she understood that what had been taken from her had not been given back, only interrupted. She passed by the man who had brought her there, and he did not meet her eyes, did not speak, because whatever he had believed before had shifted into something he could not name, and that uncertainty held him in place more effectively than any argument could have. The sheriff remained near the platform for a moment longer, looking at the rope where it swayed gently in the breeze, and then he turned away from it, not in dismissal, but in recognition that it no longer held the same meaning it had an hour ago. Ayanna reached the edge of the street and paused, her gaze drifting toward the open land where Caleb had gone, and for a second, it seemed like she might follow, like the space between them was something that needed to be closed, but she did not move, not yet, because there were things left behind that had not been settled, and leaving them untouched would only carry them forward. She turned instead, walking toward the well at the far side of town, where a bucket hung from a worn rope, and she drew it up slowly, the wood creaking softly as it rose, and when the water reached the top, she dipped her hands into it, letting the coolness settle into her skin, grounding her in something real, something simple, and for a moment, she closed her eyes, not in exhaustion, but in focus, like she was gathering herself for whatever came next. Across the street, a woman watched her, hesitant at first, then stepping forward with something in her hands, a small cloth, clean but worn, and she held it out without speaking, and Ayanna looked at it for a second before accepting it with a quiet nod. No words exchanged, just a small gesture that carried more weight than either of them would admit. Further back, the man who had spoken earlier shifted again, his voice lower now, uncertain. What if she was telling the truth, he said, not to anyone in particular. And the question hung there, unanswered, because answering it would require more than they were ready to give. Out on the road, Caleb slowed his pace slightly, not because he intended to stop, but because something in him had changed direction, subtle, almost unnoticeable, like a compass needle adjusting by a fraction of a degree, and he reached into his coat, his fingers brushing against something small, something he had carried for years without thinking about it, a piece of worn silver wrapped in leather, and he pulled it out, turning it over in his hand, the surface catching the sunlight in a way that felt familiar, and for a moment, the past pressed closer, not as memory, but as something still unfinished. He stopped then, just for a second, standing in the open with nothing around him but the wind and the wide stretch of land, and he looked down at the object in his hand, his expression unreadable, but there was a weight in that stillness, something unresolved, something that had not yet found its place. Back in town, Ayanna opened her eyes and looked toward the same horizon, her grip tightening slightly on the cloth in her hand, and though the distance between them had already grown, there was a quiet understanding forming, not spoken, not acknowledged, just there, waiting, like the beginning of something neither of them had planned but neither could ignore. And the strange thing was, even as the town tried to settle back into itself, even as people turned away and returned to their routines, there was a feeling that lingered, a sense that what had happened was not finished, that the moment at the platform had only been the first step in something larger, something that would not stay contained within the lines they had drawn, and somewhere between the road and the well, between the man who walked away and the woman who stayed, the story had quietly begun to change direction. Caleb stood there longer than he meant to, the small piece of silver resting in his palm like something that remembered him even when he tried to forget it, and the wind moved across the open land in slow, steady waves, carrying the faint echo of a place he had just left behind, a place that no longer felt finished. He turned the object once between his fingers, the worn edges catching light, and for a moment, the memory came clear, not loud, not overwhelming, just precise, like a voice, speaking exactly when it needed to, showing him a firelit night, a woman's hands steady as they worked, a quiet lesson given without expectation, and then gone, leaving behind something small that carried more weight than it should have. He closed his hand around it and exhaled, the breath slow, measured, as if he were placing that memory back where it belonged. But something resisted, something refused to settle, and that was when he heard it. Not a call, not a shout, just the faint sound of footsteps behind him. Careful, unhurried, but certain. He did not turn right away, not because he did not know who it was, but because turning meant acknowledging something he had not planned for, something that had already begun to take shape without asking him first. The footsteps stopped a few yards behind him, close enough that the space between them felt intentional, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind moving softly through the dry grass, filling the silence with something that was not empty. "You carry it like you understand it," Ayanna said, her voice steady, not accusing, not curious, just observing, and Caleb lowered his hand slightly, the silver still hidden within it, and turned just enough to see her, not fully, not facing her head on, but enough to acknowledge her presence without inviting more than he was ready to give. "I carry it because I was told to," he answered, and the words came out simple, but they did not close the distance between them, they only defined it. She stepped closer, not pressing, not crossing into his space, but narrowing the gap just enough that the connection between them felt deliberate, and her eyes moved briefly to his hand before returning to his face. "The one who told you," she said, "did not speak like the people in that town," and Caleb's jaw tightened slightly. Not in anger, but in recognition, because she was not asking, she was seeing, and that was harder to ignore. He looked out toward the horizon again, the wide stretch of land offering no answers, only distance, and for a moment, it seemed like he might walk away, might leave the question where it stood and let it fade into the wind like everything else he had left behind. But instead, he opened his hand slowly, revealing the small piece of silver, wrapped in worn leather, and he held it out just enough for her to see without offering it. Ayanna's gaze settled on it, and something in her expression shifted, not surprise, not shock, but recognition that ran deeper than either of those, something that reached back beyond this moment, beyond this day, into a place where stories were not told loudly, but carried quietly from one life to another. "My grandmother made those," she said, her voice softer now, but no less steady, and Caleb felt something in his chest shift in response, not sharp, not sudden, just enough to change the weight of the air between them. He glanced at her fully then, really looking at her for the first time since the platform, not as someone he had chosen to help, not as someone caught in a moment of injustice, but as a person standing in front of him with a connection he had not expected, and he asked, "Where is she?" Not out of curiosity, but because the question had already formed before he realized it. Ayanna's eyes did not leave his, and for a brief second, the wind seemed to still, as if even it was waiting for the answer. "She is gone," she said, and there was no sadness in the words, only truth, the kind that did not need to be softened. Caleb nodded slowly, his fingers closing again around the silver, the warmth of his hand pressing into it, grounding him in the present even as the past pressed closer, and he looked away once more, the horizon stretching wide, offering him the same path it always had, simple, open, and alone. "She taught you," Ayanna continued, not asking, and Caleb let out a quiet breath, something almost like a laugh, but without sound. "She tried," he said, and the admission carried more weight than he intended. because trying meant there had been more to learn, more to understand, and maybe more he had not yet finished. Iana studied him for a moment longer, then nodded once, as if confirming something only she could see, and she stepped back slightly, giving him space again, but not leaving, not turning away, because the space between them had changed now, shaped by something neither of them could ignore. The wind picked up again, brushing past them, carrying dust and sunlight across the open land, and Caleb looked down at the silver in his hand one last time before slipping it back into his coat. The movement slow, deliberate, like placing a piece back into a story he had not meant to reopen. He shifted his weight, his body angling slightly toward the road again, but he did not take a step, not yet, because the choice in front of him was no longer as simple as it had been before. No longer just about leaving or staying, but about something else. Entirely. Something that had begun the moment he chose to stop walking, and now refused to let him return to the man he had been before. Caleb did not move, not forward, not back, just stood there with the weight of her words settling into him the same way the desert heat settles into stone, slow but impossible to ignore, and for a moment the world around them felt smaller, quieter, like everything beyond that stretch of land had stepped away to give space to something neither of them had planned. He drew a breath, steady, controlled, and looked out across the open horizon again, but it no longer looked the same, no longer just a road leading away from trouble, because now it carried something else, something unfinished. She taught you something worth carrying, Iana said after a while, her voice calm, not pressing, just placing the truth where it could be seen. And Caleb let the words sit there, turning them over the same way he had turned the silver in his hand, not rejecting them, not accepting them either, just feeling their shape. She taught me to leave before things got complicated, he answered finally, and there was a faint edge of honesty in it, something that admitted more than he usually allowed. And Iana watched him with that same steady gaze, the kind that did not rush to fill silence, the kind that understood waiting. Then why did you not leave today? She asked. And it was not a challenge, not even a question meant to trap him, just a simple line drawn between what he said and what he had done, and that line did not accuse, it revealed. Caleb shifted his weight slightly, the dust under his boots stirring just enough to mark the movement, and for a second, he almost answered the way he always had, with something short, something that closed the door before it opened too far, but the words did not come that way this time. They came slower, more deliberate. Because I have seen what happens when no one stays, he said, and that was the closest he had come to naming it, the closest he had come to admitting that the past he carried was not just memory, but something that still shaped his steps. Iana nodded once, as if that was enough, as if she did not need more explanation than that, and the space between them settled into something quieter, not empty, but understood. The wind moved again, brushing past them, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant wood smoke from the town behind them, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, letting that quiet hold, letting it do the work words could not. Then Iana turned slightly, her gaze shifting back toward the town, and Caleb followed it without meaning to, seeing the buildings small. In the distance now, the place where everything had shifted only an hour ago, and it felt different from here, less certain, less fixed. They will not forget this, she said, not as a warning, not as a promise, just as something that was already true, and Caleb nodded once, because he understood that kind of place, understood how memory worked when it was tied to pride and fear. Neither will you, he replied, and Iana's expression changed just slightly, not in surprise, but in acknowledgement, because he was not speaking about the town anymore, he was speaking about her, about what had almost happened, about what had been stopped but not erased. She looked back at him then, her eyes steady. No, she said simply, and there was no bitterness in it, only clarity. Caleb let out a slow breath, his gaze drifting once more to the road, the path still open, still waiting, but it no longer felt like an escape, not in the way it had before, and he knew that if he walked now, he would carry more than he had when he arrived, not just the memory of a moment, but the weight of what it meant to step into it. He reached into his coat again, his fingers brushing the silver once more, but this time he did not take it out. He just held it there for a second, feeling its presence, and then let his hand fall back to his side. Where will you go? He asked, and the question came without calculation, without reason, just something that needed to be said. Ayana looked out at the land, the same horizon he had been studying, and for a moment, it seemed like she might not answer, like the question itself was too simple for what it held. But then she spoke, "Where I am not already judged." And there was a quiet strength in that, not defiance, not escape, but a decision shaped by something deeper. Caleb nodded slowly, understanding more than he let show, because he had lived that same choice in a different way, had walked away from places that asked him to be something he was not, and had learned how to survive in the spaces in between. The wind picked up again, a little stronger now, pushing against them both, carrying dust and sunlight across the open land. And Caleb took a step. Not away, not yet, just forward enough to feel the ground shift beneath him. And he paused there, caught between movement and stillness, between leaving and staying, and for the first time in a long time, he did not know which direction he would choose, only that whatever came next would not be as simple as walking away. Caleb stood there with one foot slightly ahead of the other, the kind of stance that usually meant a man had already chosen his direction. But this time the step did not carry through. It held, suspended between what he had always done and what something inside him was beginning to ask for. And the wind pressed lightly against his coat as if urging him forward, but not telling him where. Ayana watched that hesitation without speaking, because she understood something most people did not, that the hardest decisions were not made in motion. They were made in stillness, in that quiet space where a man could no longer pretend he did not see what was in front of him. Behind them, the town remained where it was, small against the wide land. But its presence had not faded. It lingered like a question that had not been answered, and Caleb knew that if he walked now, that question would follow him farther than any mile he could put behind it. "There are others," Ayana said after a while, her voice steady, not urgent, just placing another piece into the space between them. And Caleb glanced at her, not sharply, but with a slow awareness that the moment was shifting again. "Others," he repeated, and she nodded once. "The ones you heard about," she said. "The ones they needed a story for." And the words settled in, quiet but heavy, because they reached beyond her, beyond the town, into something larger, something that did not end when one rope was undone. Caleb looked back toward the distant buildings, his eyes narrowing slightly, not in suspicion, but in thought, and the memory of the man's voice, the way he had said he saw enough, returned with a different weight now, less certainty, more intention, and that difference mattered. "You think they will follow?" he said, not as a question, but as a recognition, and Ayana did not answer right away. She let the wind pass between them first, let the silence carry the meaning before she placed words on it. "I think they already are," she said, and there was no fear in it, only clarity. Caleb exhaled slowly, the breath steady, and for a moment he closed his eyes, not to escape the thought, but to settle it, to place it where it could be seen without rushing it into action. And when he opened them again, the road in front of him looked different, not just a path away, but a line that connected things he had tried to keep separate. He shifted his weight again, this time letting the step complete, not forward along the road he had planned to take, but turning slightly, angling back, toward the town. And the movement was small, almost unnoticeable, but it carried more decision than anything he had done so far. Ayana saw it. Of course she did. And she did not smile, did not react. She only watched, because she understood that naming a choice too early could weaken it, could turn it into something it was not meant to be. "You could still leave," she said, not to challenge him, but to make the truth clear, to leave the door open the way it always had been. And Caleb nodded, once, acknowledging it. "I could," he said, and there was no doubt in that, no hesitation, just a fact. But he did not move toward that path again. He remained where he was, facing slightly back, as if the land itself had shifted under his feet. The wind moved stronger now, lifting dust from the ground, carrying it across the space between them, and for a moment, the town blurred in the distance, its edges softened by the movement. And Caleb watched it through that shifting veil, seeing not just what it was, but what it might become depending on what happened next. "If they come," he said slowly, "they will not ask questions first." And Ayana's gaze remained steady. "No," she answered, "they will not." And there was no bitterness in her voice, only understanding, because she had lived in that truth longer than he had. Caleb reached into his coat again, his fingers brushing the silver, and this time he took it out, holding it in the light for a second longer than before, as if measuring it against the moment. And then he closed his hand around it once more, not hiding it, not displaying it, just holding it, grounding himself in something that connected past and present in a way he could not ignore anymore. Then standing once is not enough, he said, almost to himself, and Ayanna heard it. Of course she did, and she nodded once, because that was the part most people never understood, that stopping something once did not end it. It only revealed what would come next. Caleb took another step, this time fully turning his body toward the town, and the decision settled into him not as a sudden shift, but as something that had been building quietly since the moment he first heard her voice, something that had finally found its place. You said you would go where you are not judged, he said, glancing at her briefly, and she met his eyes without hesitation. Yes, she answered, and Caleb looked back toward the town, the distance between them already shorter in his mind than it had been a moment ago. That place might not be far yet, he said, and the words were not a promise, not a guarantee, just an acknowledgement that the road ahead had changed. The wind carried through them again, steady and constant, and for the first time since he had stopped walking, Caleb moved with purpose, not away from what had happened, but back toward it, not as a man looking for trouble, but as a man who understood that leaving now would not make him free, it would only make him absent, and there was a difference he could no longer ignore. The road back felt shorter than it should have, not because the distance had changed, but because the weight of the decision carried him faster than his steps ever could, and Caleb did not rush, did not break into anything more than that steady, measured pace. But there was purpose in it now, something that had not been there when he first walked away. Ayanna moved beside him without matching his stride, not trailing, not leading, just there. Her presence quiet but undeniable, like the shadow of something that had already taken shape. The town grew larger again, the outlines of buildings sharpening as the dust settled, and with each step closer, the silence they had left behind seemed to return, waiting, as if the place itself had not moved forward without them. A figure stood near the edge of the street when they approached. The sheriff, not in the center this time, not holding anything, just watching, his posture different now, less rigid, more uncertain, like a man who had realized the ground beneath him was not as solid as he believed. Caleb did not slow as he neared him, did not change direction, just walked straight on, and the sheriff held his place for a moment before stepping aside, not forced, not commanded, simply choosing to move. And that quiet action said more than anything he could have spoken. They asked questions after you left, the sheriff said as Caleb passed, his voice low, almost thoughtful, and Caleb stopped just enough to hear it fully, his gaze shifting slightly but not turning all the way. And, he said, not asking, just leaving space for the rest, and the sheriff exhaled slowly. And the answers did not come easy, he admitted, and there was something in that admission. Something that suggested the man standing there was not the same one who had held the rope. Caleb nodded, once, acknowledging it, and then continued forward, stepping into the street where the crowd had once gathered. Now thinner, quieter, the people scattered in small groups, voices low, eyes turning as he passed, not with anger, not with certainty, but with something more complicated, something closer to reflection. Ayanna walked beside him until they reached the center, and then she stopped, her gaze moving across the faces around them, not searching for approval, not expecting anything, just seeing them as they were. And for a moment, no one spoke, because whatever had been built there earlier had already fallen, and no one knew what to replace it with. A man near the well stepped forward slightly, hesitant, his hat held in his hands instead of on his head, and he looked at Ayanna, not boldly, not weakly, just honestly. We did not know, he said, and the words were simple, but they carried something new, something that had not been there before, and Ayanna held his gaze for a moment before answering. You did not ask, and there was no anger in it, no accusation, just truth, and the man lowered his eyes slightly, not in shame, but in understanding. Caleb watched the exchange without interrupting, his presence still, grounded, not pushing, not guiding, just there, and that presence seemed to hold the space steady, allowing something else to take root where certainty had once been. The wind moved through again, softer now, carrying the sound of loose boards and distant horses, ordinary sounds that felt different in the quiet that followed. The sheriff stepped forward once more, slower this time, his gaze moving between Caleb and Ayanna, and for a moment it seemed like he might try to reclaim something, might try to shape the moment into something familiar. But instead he stopped a few feet away and spoke with a tone that carried less authority and more weight. "If there are others," he said, "then we need to know." And Caleb met his gaze fully now, steady, unflinching. "Then start listening," he replied, and the words did not land as instruction, but as a simple direction, one that could be followed or ignored, but no longer denied. Ayanna stepped forward, slightly, her posture unchanged, her voice calm as she spoke. "They will come looking for someone to blame," she said. "That is easier than finding truth." And the people around them shifted again, not retreating, not advancing, just adjusting, as if they were beginning to understand the shape of what stood before them. Caleb glanced around the street once more, taking in the faces, the place, the remnants of what had almost happened, and then he looked back toward the open road, not as an escape this time, but as a path that connected everything they were now standing in, and he knew, without needing to say it, that leaving would no longer be the same as it had been before. He reached into his coat once more, his fingers brushing the silver, and for a second, he held it there, not taking it out, just feeling it, letting it remind him of what had been given and what still remained, and then he let his hand fall, his gaze settling back on the town, not as something to pass through, but as something he had chosen to stand within, at least for now, and that choice, quiet as it was, carried further than any step he had taken so far. The town did not erupt into action, it did not break into noise or confusion. It settled into something quieter, something heavier, like a place learning how to stand after realizing it had been leaning on the wrong thing for too long. And Caleb felt that shift the same way a man feels a change in weather before the clouds arrive, not seen, but understood. He remained where he was, not stepping forward, not stepping back, just holding the space he had taken, because this was no longer about him doing something. It was about what others would choose to do. Now that the moment had been opened, Ayanna stood beside him, her presence steady, not asking for anything, not claiming anything, just existing in a way that could no longer be ignored. And that alone was enough to change the way people looked, the way they stood, the way they spoke. The sheriff exhaled slowly, his shoulders easing as if he had set something down he had been carrying too long, and he turned slightly, not away from them, but toward the people gathered, his voice coming out, lower, more measured than before. "We were ready to act without knowing," he said, and the admission was simple, but it carried weight because it was spoken out loud, because it placed something into the open that could not be taken back. No one answered right away, not because they disagreed, but because agreeing required them to accept what they had almost done, and that was not an easy thing to face. A man near the far side of the street shifted his stance, looking toward the others, then back at Ayanna. "Then we find out," he said, uncertain but willing, and that was new, that willingness, that quiet step toward something more difficult than blame. Caleb watched that change without interfering, because he understood that this part did not belong to him. It belonged to them, to the town, to the people who had to decide whether they would stay the same or become something else. Ayanna glanced at him once, brief, and there was something in that look, not gratitude, not expectation, just recognition, like she understood that what he had done was not meant to be carried further than this moment unless others chose to carry it themselves. The wind moved through again, softer now, and the rope behind them creaked lightly against the wood, a sound that no longer held the same meaning, just a reminder of what had been, and Caleb let his gaze drift to it for a second before looking away, because the moment it represented had already passed. The sheriff stepped forward once more, stopping a few feet from Ayanna, his posture careful, not cautious, just aware, and he spoke again. "If you speak, we will listen." And the words were not perfect, not strong, but they were real, and that was enough. Ayanna did not answer immediately. She let the silence hold, let the weight of what had been offered settle fully, and then she nodded once, her voice calm when it came. "Then listen to more than what is easy," she said. and there was no demand in it, only direction. The people around them shifted again, but this time it was different, not retreating, not uncertain, but adjusting, as if they were beginning to understand how to stand in a place where certainty was no longer given. Freely, Caleb took a slow breath. The air warmed now as the day moved forward, and for the first time since he had stepped into this town, he felt something loosen inside him. Not relief, not satisfaction, just the quiet release that comes when a thing is no longer being held alone. He reached into his coat once more, his fingers brushing the silver, and this time he left it there, because he no longer needed to hold it to remember. The lesson it carried had already found its place in the moment. Ayanna stepped forward then, moving slightly ahead of him, not leaving, just taking her place within the space that had been made, and the people watched her, not with judgment now, but with attention, real attention, the kind that required them to set aside what they thought they knew. Caleb turned his head slightly, looking out past the town once more, the open land stretching beyond, still there, still waiting. But it no longer called to him the same way, because he understood now that leaving was not the only way to survive. Sometimes staying was the harder path, and the one that mattered. The wind carried through the street again, lifting dust in small spirals that caught the light before, settling back down, and in that quiet movement, something had changed, not loudly, not completely, but enough that it could not be undone, and Caleb Rourke stood there, not as a man who had fixed anything, not as a man who had claimed anything, but as a man who had chosen not to walk away, and that choice, simple as it was, had given the moment room to become something else entirely. The sun had climbed high by the time the voices began to settle into something steady, not loud, not certain, but moving in a direction that had not existed that morning, and Caleb stood at the edge of it, not inside the circle, not outside of it either, just near enough to feel its shape without needing to control it. Ayanna spoke in that quiet way of hers, not rushing, not filling space for the sake of sound, but placing each word where it could be carried and considered, and the people listened, not all at once, not perfectly, but enough to change the rhythm of the town from what it had been. The sheriff remained a few steps back, no longer the center, no longer the one who decided when things ended, his hands resting at his sides, his eyes moving between faces as if he were learning them again without the weight of assumption. A man who had stood loudest earlier now spoke softer, asking questions that felt awkward in his mouth, and another answered with less certainty than before, and in that exchange, something shifted again, not a resolution, not a clean ending, but a beginning that did not need to be named. The rope still hung from the beam, swaying lightly in the breeze, but no one looked at it the same way. It had become something else, not a tool, not a decision, just a piece of worn fiber that would be taken down before nightfall, without ceremony, without discussion. Because its meaning had already changed, Caleb watched it for a moment and then let his gaze move past it, because he understood that what mattered was not the thing itself, but the choice that had been made around it, the space that had been opened when someone refused to accept what everyone else had agreed upon. Ayanna stepped back when she was finished speaking, not waiting for approval, not asking for anything more, and the people did not rush to fill the silence that followed. They let it sit, let it settle, and in that stillness, something honest took root. Caleb shifted his weight slightly, feeling the ground beneath his boots, the familiar pull of the open land beyond the town, and for a moment he considered it again, the road, the distance, the quiet life he had built where no one asked questions he did not want to answer, and he knew he could still choose it, could still turn and leave before the day was done, and no one would follow, no one would stop him, because his part in this had never been claimed by anyone but himself. He reached into his coat one last time and brought out the small piece of silver, holding it in the light where it caught the sun in a dull, steady glow, and he turned it between his fingers, not searching for meaning anymore, but recognizing it, recognizing that it had not brought him here. It had only reminded him of what he already knew. He stepped forward then, closing the distance between himself and Ayanna by a few feet, and when he spoke, his voice was low, steady, the kind that did not ask to be heard but was heard anyway. "It was yours before it was mine," he said, and he held the silver out to her, not as a gift, not as a gesture, but as something returning to where it belonged. Ayanna looked at it, her expression unchanged, but there was something in her eyes that softened, not in weakness, not in gratitude, but in recognition. And she took it carefully, her fingers closing around it with a familiarity that did not need to be explained. For a moment, neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left to say that would add to what had already been understood, and then Caleb stepped back again, not turning away immediately, just giving the moment space to settle. The wind moved through once more, carrying the sound of distant hooves somewhere beyond the ridge, a reminder that the world outside this town had not stopped, that whatever came next would not wait for them to be ready. Ayana looked out toward that same horizon, the silver now resting in her hand, and then back at Caleb, her voice quiet when she spoke. "You did not stay," she said, and he met her gaze, understanding the difference she was marking. "I did not leave," he answered, and that was enough, because the space between those two things held everything that mattered. The town continued to shift around them, slowly, imperfectly, but moving, and Caleb turned then, finally, not toward the far horizon this time, but along the edge of the street, walking without urgency, without purpose beyond the step itself, and no one called after him. No one tried to hold him there, because they understood, in their own quiet way, that what he had done did not belong to them to keep. The rope would come down, the questions would continue, the answers would come slowly, and the land would remain as it always had, wide and indifferent, holding all of it without judgment. And somewhere between the dust and the light, between the man who chose not to walk away and the woman who chose to stand, something had taken shape. That did not need a name, something that would not be written down or spoken loudly, but would remain, carried in small ways, in quiet choices, in the space where a person decides whether to look away or stay. And in that space, without noise, without witness, justice had already passed through and moved on.